all of us have opinions. We talk to our friends, our students, our family members, and rarely would we expect that they would really affect what governments do for policies. But there are some times, and that's what decision makers in the United States pay attention to. If I'm president, if I'm governor, if I'm a legislature, I'm a member of our parliament, when do I really care? Well, when I first see that some issue that's being discussed actually could affect the outcome of an election. And so the future of the Affordable Care Act in the United States is likely to be an important issue in the upcoming 2014 election and 2016 election. Some of the major changes proposed in Medicare, which is our program, healthcare program for retirees, could be a major issue. Abortion, which we discussed earlier, turns out to be an important voting issue for a share of people in many elections for that. So when you identify that people say that it's so intense to them, their views, their preferences, and then suddenly public opinion counts a lot. People running for office pay attention to that. The second thing is, it turns out that if I'm running for office all the time, even if I don't mean it, even if I took all our courses, I often set my priorities based on what voters think. And I know I should be setting them based on the best evidence, the best science, but a lot of public officials' priorities are driven by the fact, wow, an awful lot of public is worried about this disease, this illness, this age group for that. And it's important if that actually affects the decisions that policymakers make. So here's a perfect example. If you're a student and you're strong and good, you should go look and say, what are the major killers in the United States? And that we should be allocating our funds to the major killers. Number 1 killer, number 5 killer, that's where it is, mortality and morbidity. It turns out that cancer is by far the largest recipient of all federal research and treatment money in the United States. But it's actually not the top killer. The top killer is heart disease. But what can you say about cancer? What you can say about cancer is it has been the top public preference for over 40 years for spending. And it is, if you watch someone running for office stand up and say, we should be doing more about cancer. So it has a huge effect. The issue of obesity, which Michelle Obama, as First Lady, has taken on and championed, has become much more important in the public agenda than it used to be. And suddenly millions of dollars that never existed before are flowing to programs on research on obesity and educating young people on obesity, in marches on obesity, but it's driven by public preferences. Not necessarily that a panel of scientists sat around and said, what are the top 2 things we should be spending our funds on? How do I know, I'm a student, that public opinion, I saw some survey, some poll, something in the newspaper, when is anybody going to pay attention to it? Well, if the article says it could affect voting, right away you pay attention to it. Also, it's very, very unfair. If you're a student of health policy, you may be interested in people all over the world, the globe, people who are very deprived with very unusual illnesses, but public opinion tends to be stronger if it is something directly important to a lot of people's lives. For it, it's very unfair. Public opinion is very unfair. They should be worried about all kinds of groups. But if they have experience with the issue, with the health problem, with a life experience, they respond very, very different. And also, if it involves some basic value that people have or believe. So there are 2. One is, I mentioned, abortion. And so to many people, this is a fundamental right for women in America. This is not an issue. For others, it's basically ending an infant's life. So it is very, very important to it. Their opinions are strong. They're active for it. In the recent debate over implementing the Affordable Care Act the president's been involved in, he made a promise that people could keep their health insurance plans. even if they weren't the best. And he then turns out to have in his plan, it's not very possible for most people to do that. It turned out that this, in the American public, was much broader than a health policy. It was a value issue where people felt, and almost half the public believed, that the president no longer had honesty and integrity. He lied to them. Well, this isn't an issue about who has the best health plan and should be able to choose it. It was a fundamental belief in value. And so that turns out to have a huger effect on what goes on. If you do something that affects people's values for that. Many issues are very technical, they're important, but they don't feel to do that. And then if you're in health policy, this is something that can just make you incredibly concerned. At times you're gnawing your teeth, and then sometimes you're very happy. If someone well-known has a health problem, they're a ball player, they're a political figure, they're an actor, an actress, people treat them like their next-door neighbors. Everybody says, my God, why aren't we doing more about colon cancer? Why aren't we doing more about head injuries? Why aren't we doing more about this? And just last week they were talking about some other issue. For that. So we are often driven in our interests by people People are fascinated by the lives of famous people, and many of the lives of famous people actually have health problems. And someone has a low birth weight baby. And suddenly the nation is, why aren't we doing more for low birth weight babies? How are low birth weight babies cared for in your community? But last week we were called about cancer. If I'm a student and I have to think through in my paper and everything else, how do I know that people are really talking about an issue? So first is you just do a search, which you can now do in a computer. Is this issue being mentioned all in the newspaper? And it's pretty simple. If it's never mentioned in a newspaper, it's not likely being discussed by millions of people. And do they have any life experience with this? And then this is a test. And my colleagues are bothered because we have to teach you much more sophisticated stuff. And I say to my students, you want to know if it's important? Call your parents on the phone. Ask them what they're talking about. If they're talking about this issue, it's important. If all they say to you is, oh, it's nice that you're interested in this, dear, but they're not mentioning this issue, it's not very important to them. And so if people talk about things, it's really important. And if it's just something where you call them on the phone and say, well, should we be spending money on something they have never thought about? Oh, yes or no. It's not important because they're never talking about it. So that's it. And then you can actually go to polls. And the United States is supporting a polling industry that's $1 billion of expenditures. And almost every month they'll say, this is important to you. If you're on that list, you worry a lot how the public feels. If it's not on the list, you just say, this is fun, this is interesting, it's not important.